Mr. Pop.
Hello, welcome to Sketchyville. Today we're going to be finishing up the 2020 broom box. I need to start off with a little disclaimer here. Parts of this video are pretty old. I started making the accessories to go in the box before I made the box itself, so you're going to be seeing some of my very first attempts at trying to film my process. The lighting is terrible, the angles aren't great, the camera mount bounces around, but it is what it is, so please just bear with me. The first thing I made to go in the box is a laptop that's broadcasting a never-ending Zoom meeting. I made this back in July of 2020, and honestly, I could do it a lot better if I did it again today. But sometimes it's important to embrace your early attempts, right? I'm not going to show you the details because I wouldn't even do it the same way again, but if you're interested, it's made from polymer clay. Next is a desk made from eyebrow wax sticks and mat board. To give it the proper thickness for my scale, I glued two of everything together and then filled in the seams with spackle to smooth it out. Once the spackle was dry, I filed everything smooth and then cut some coffee stir sticks to use as skirting under the desk. This little detail not only adds a bit of realism, but it also gives an additional surface to glue the legs to, and it makes the whole construction a little bit sturdier. Once all of the pieces were prepped, I glued everything together. After the glue had dried, I base coated the entire desk with black paint and then gave it a final coat of brown paint. I finished this piece off by dry brushing white paint around the edges to make the desk look beat up and used. Now, what would 2020 be without a hoard of toilet paper? Unfortunately, the bulk of my footage for these little beauties disappeared. Full disclosure, I just got a new camera and I may have forgotten to push play. You'll just have to take my word for it when I tell you that I made these by rolling a snake of polymer clay around a wooden skewer, and then I cut the roll into toilet paper-sized chunks. Once the base forms were made, I used a small brush to paint the inside of the hole with a cardboard-colored paint. Then, to make them look like actual toilet paper and not just tubes of clay, I took a single ply of toilet paper, and by that I mean I took a sheet of toilet paper and peeled all the layers apart, and then I glued it around the outside. The next thing I needed for my 2020 experience was vodka. Lots and lots of vodka. I wanted the bottles to be clear, so I decided to make them with UV resin, and for that, I needed to make a mold. I cut a glue stick down to size and then rounded the edges with a file. Then, I glued a small skewer to the top of the glue stick to make a bottle shape. I used a 2-part silicone mold putty to make a mold from my glue stick bottle form. Then, I made half a bottle by curing the UV resin in layers. Now, if you're not using a clear mold, it's important to do it in relatively thin layers, or your final piece is going to end up sticky. Once I made 2 halves of a bottle, I glued them together, which, again, I lost the footage of, to make a whole bottle of vodka. Now, for the star of our show, Mr. Skelly. This is just a dollar store skeleton. I bought a case of them back in October because who doesn't need 144-inch scale skeletons? Am I right? The original finish on these guys is pretty awful, and the plastic they're made out of can be ridiculously difficult to get the paint to stick to. So prepping them is really important. You're going to want to sand and trim off any weird bits of plastic that are sticking out, and give them a quick wipe with alcohol or nail polish remover before painting. Nail polish remover can melt the plastic, so if you do use it, be very gentle. I separated the head just to make it a little easier to paint. I end up disarticulating this guy completely though, and I probably should have done that before I painted him. Life is a learning process. I base painted this guy with a taupe colored paint to look a little bit more like bone, and then I finished him off with a dirty black and brown wash. Once the paint was dry, I scrubbed black and brown pastel powders into some of the nooks and crannies just to give him a little bit more dimension. Now, it's time to dismember him. Now, I want Mr. Skelly to be posed in sort of a fetal position. These guys are not articulated, so I cut them apart at all the joints. If you do this, be sure to keep track of which bones go where. It just makes it easier when you're putting them back together. So, this isn't my first rodeo. I had to scrap the first skeleton I tried to make because if it wasn't bad enough that these guys are hard to paint, they are impossible to glue. Hot glue is your friend here. In fact, nothing else I tried worked. The glue would just pop off as soon as it dried. There is footage that might go up on our TikTok channel of me swearing colorfully as Mr. Skelly's limbs fall off for the 50 billionth time. Speaking of which, follow us on TikTok for lessons in inventive swearing. I placed my guy's hands on his knees to cover up the raw edges from my cuts. I had originally planned to put him in more of a wrapped fetal position, kind of like he's shaking in the corner, but I just didn't feel like breaking out my paints to touch up these spots. So to further hide my laziness, I took some blooded tufts for model terrain making and added some black chalk to darken it up. And then I glued the little bits of that terrain tuft over the exposed cuts and in other strategic places to look like my guy had been sitting there in his dank basement for quite a while. To make sure that the moss stayed in place, I dabbed some matte sealer over it to glue him down without leaving a shine behind. Lastly, he needed some disintegrated clothing. I took some strips of fabric and just grunged them up with a really dirty paint wash. Once the paint on the fabric had dried, I draped the strips kind of strategically to look like clothing that had just basically disintegrated over time. One last color wash to kind of tie everything together, and our little guy is complete. Now, it's finally time to assemble our room. I used rubber cement to glue everything in because I wasn't sure if I was going to want to move any of the elements around. And it's just really easy to switch things if you're using rubber cement. I did go back later and glue some of the pieces in place permanently with Fabri-Tac. I made these little hand sanitizers the exact same way I made the vodka bottles. The only difference was that I created the form in polymer clay before making a mold from it. These little Lysol bottles were made from glue sticks. I scored an edge in the stick where the cap would meet the can, and then just painted the whole thing to look like a can of Lysol. The Clorox canisters were formed from polymer clay and then painted. Now, the labels for everything that you're seeing here were just printed out and then glued to the bottles before they were sealed with a coat of triple thick sealer. For the boxes of gloves, I just found a template online for a Kleenex box and then added some graphics to make it look like a box of gloves. I then took the whole thing, printed it onto cardstock, and cut and folded them into boxes. The absentee ballot that you're seeing here was just printed out and cut to size. And the coffee mug was something that my husband 3D printed, and I just painted it for the project. And last but not least, 2020 made us all very familiar with masks. My youngest kid made this broken mask for me from paper and thread. Now, if you want more in-depth tutorials on any of the things that I made to go in my box that I didn't show, just leave a comment and let me know. I didn't want this video to be 3 hours long, so I cut a lot of things out. But I'd be happy to create the content for you in the future if you have an interest. So as you can tell, the accessories in the room don't match the age state of Mr. Skelly. So it's time to get messy. Now, this is the scary part because I've spent a lot of time making all of the things that go into this box. And if I mess up the aging, I'm pretty much going to ruin everything. So it took a little courage to dive into this step. I made 3 washes, a black wash, a walnut, and a tea dye. I did this to get a range of colors and staining in my aging. As I applied the washes, I tried to think about where water would seep into the room and pool, which surfaces would absorb dampness and be more discolored than others. In some places I allowed the washes to drip, and in others I just dabbed it on. I also layered additional coats of wash in areas where I wanted it to be more mucky and dirty. Once I had the first layer of wash done and it had dried completely, I used black and brown ground pastel powder to add even more dirt into the room. And after I dirtied everything up with the black and brown, I used some white pastel powder to add a layer of dust to all the surfaces in the room. Mr. Skelly's sporting some mold and mildew, so there needs to be some of that on other surfaces in the room too. I mixed it up the exact same way I did before, but this time I added a little matte Mod Podge into the mix, and that makes it stick a little better without needing a sealer afterwards. I knew I wanted the coffee cup to be filled with grossness, so I placed a little 2-part epoxy into the bottom of the cup just to fill it up. Then I started thinking about where mold would grow. I looked for places where my aging had turned out just a little bit darker and put some there. Also places where water would pool, that needed some mold. And lastly, any spots that I just didn't like the look of and wanted to hide. Mr. Skelly got some additional mold in the spots where he was touching the floor. And then, lastly, after the epoxy had hardened, the coffee cup was filled with it. Gross. Once the mold had completely dried, I did another layer of color wash. This time I only used black and I mixed it a little bit stronger than I had the first time. I dabbed this wash around the moldy areas just to darken everything up a little bit more. And then in any other places that I thought needed to look just a little bit more damaged. I had a visitor while I was finishing up the box, and I just want to give you a warning. Look away if snakes frighten you. 3, 2, 1. Frankie came to check out my room box. She totally approves. Okay, you're safe now. She's gone. You can look at your screen again. Once I had finished the black wash, it was done. The box is complete. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more crafting projects, and be sure to click the bell to be notified when we post a new video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps us out. If you didn't like this video, that's okay. Someday we'll all be skeletons in a box and it won't even matter. That's it for 2020 and all of the pain and trauma it brought us. I'm closing the door on it. It's time to heal and move on. Thanks for visiting Sketchyville. We hope you'll come back soon.
Mr. Pop.